Hey, it's Sean Price with Price and Price Realtors, and I wanted to talk about a detail of um, for a buyer in real estate in the state of Virginia, why it's important to have a buyer's agent and what that buyer's agent actually does for you. And the reason I want to say this is because I had a call from a buyer that came through Zillow. And the buyer had called and was looking to look at a property. So I went and I met this buyer at the property, and they actually had an agent. They did have representation, which was absolutely fine. That's not a problem. But the challenge is, if they had a buyer's agent, they should not have been calling other agents. And here's why. In Virginia, there is what's called representation. And so there is seller's representation, which is the listing agent or the agent that basically is working for the seller has a fiduciary responsibility to look out for the best interest of that seller. Okay, so that's seller representation. Their job is to sell that house for the highest price possible to help their seller reach their goals. Buyer representation is what this client had, this client of another agent. Buyer's representation is where the buyer's best interests are being represented by the agent. In other words, that buyer's agent is representing the best interest and has a fiduciary responsibility to represent the best interest of that buyer. So in that situation where the agent was calling and ended up talking to, could have been the listing agent or ended up talking to me, if they ended up talking to the listing agent, or if a buyer walks into an open house and the listing agent is holding the open house, anything that buyer says to that agent, the agent can use and will share with the seller. So they will use that against you in negotiations. So that's why it's so important that when you have a buyer's agent, number one, that you have a buyer's agent because they're going to look out for your interest. But number two, any communication you have regarding real estate needs to go through that buyer's agent so that they can ensure that you're not divulging information that could be detrimental in a negotiation. They need to make sure that you're positioning yourself appropriately, make sure that your interests are being looked out for, make sure that you're paying the right amount of money for the property, and so on. So those are the two main representations. You've got seller representation and buyer representation. And if you go into a situation, let's say you go to an open house, and you do not have a buyer's agent, and that listing agent decides that they want to represent you as well. So now that agent is representing both the buyer and the seller. Well, this is called dual representation. And what that means is the agent is actually not representing either one. The agent is representing the transaction. So in a situation in dual representation, you have the agent does not have a fiduciary responsibility to either party. So they have privacy, and they're not going to be able to share private information back and forth. But they don't have a fiduciary responsibility, and they can't really advise you on either side of the transaction. Kelly and I, we don't do dual representation. If we have a situation where we could potentially represent the buyer and the seller, we will refer one of them to another agent so that they make sure they have fair representation in the transaction. So that's dual representation. And then lastly is designated representation. Sorry about that. And designated representation is when, for example, we're with Long and Foster. Kelly and I are with Long and Foster. If we are representing a buyer and then the buyer is putting an offer in on a house where the seller is represented by Long and Foster as well, because we have the same brokerage, Long and Foster would designate Kelly and I to represent the buyer and then the listing agent to represent the seller. So that's a designated representation, and in that situation, each buyer and seller would have adequate representation. They would have somebody who's looking out for their best interest. Okay, so seller representation, that agent is only representing the seller. Buyer's representation, that agent is looking out for the best interest of the buyer. Designated representation is both agents are involved, same broker, but there is individual representation. Dual representation, the agent is not looking out for the buyer or the seller, they are working for the transaction. So that's why it's important to keep these things in mind. So that buyer that called and ended up speaking with me, had I been the listing agent, they shared a lot of information with me in the conversation. if I had been the listing agent, I would have had an ethical and a fiduciary responsibility to share that with the seller and use that in a negotiation should they put an offer in. So whenever Kelly and I work with our buyers, we always give them a stack of our business cards, just in case they do want to go out on a Sunday or something and go to open houses. They can hand our business card to the seller's agent, so they don't have to worry about saying something that will go, could be detrimental to them. And any conversation that they have regarding an actual property they want to put an offer in goes through us, because we are the representation. And the buyer that contacted us did not have their representation and could have made some pretty significant mistakes. Okay, I hope that makes sense. If you have any questions or concerns regarding this, please feel free to email us or reach out to us private message, or you can give us a call as well. All right, I look forward to seeing you on the next video.